By the late 1970s, the FBI were hot on the trail of a California-based serial killer that they dubbed the Freeway Killer. The bodies of boys and young men were popping up at an alarming rate. We're talking dozens, possibly as many as 100. Bodies were discovered between 1968 and the late 70s, all boys and young men, in their mid-20s, all the way down to as young as 12 years old. The killings were brutal, even in the golden age of serial killers, when serial murders made daily headlines. Authorities had a hard time coping with the sheer brutality and young age of the boys that they found. They'd been bound, beaten, tortured, assaulted, and strangled. Most of them were transients, runaways, hikers. In other words, kids that nobody would miss. The problem was, the FBI weren't looking for one killer, as they thought. They were actually dealing with 3 separate killings that just happened to overlap in every way imaginable. Their victim profile, manner of killing, how they disposed of the bodies, and even the areas and timeline that they operated in all overlapped. The majority of the victims were found in Southern California, with some ranging as far as Orange County and the wider Los Angeles County. That's a very tight area for this enormous amount of deaths, so you can see why authorities were treading water. Now, William Bonin and Patrick Kearney, 2 of the killers operating during this time, are going to be stories for another day. I can only open one can of psychotic worms at a time. Thank you very much. Today, we're going to look at Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer, the man who kept a literal scorecard of his victims, listing them like some macabre sports card collector, and possibly one of the most bizarre ways that I've seen a serial murderer keep mementos of his victims. Let's get into it. So with this investigation going on in the background, with police scrambling to get at least a slim piece of evidence to tie to a suspect, all they knew was that they had around 60 victims on their docket, not counting the missing persons cases that they suspected to be part of this horrendous decade of killings. The papers called the killers the Butchers of LA, and the police were under a great deal of scrutiny for being unable to catch them for so long. Kearney was arrested first, but the bodies didn't stop coming. When they arrested Bonin, police thought the decade of death was finally behind them. But still, young men's corpses kept turning up. They had no more rabbit holes to go down, no more suspects, and seemingly no end in sight. Finally, one random traffic stop was about to change everything. On May 14, 1984, at 1 a.m, a patrol car pulled over a car on the San Diego Freeway in Mission Viejo, California. The car was swerving and the officers suspected a drunk driver. They were right. When they pulled him over, a rather prim-looking man got out of the driver's seat, sending a beer bottle onto the tar road as he did so. His fly was undone. He was unsteady on his feet, and there was a passenger in the front side passenger seat. The driver's license identified the driver as 38-year-old Randy Stephen Kraft, who promptly failed the field sobriety test. The officers arrested him and went to check up on his passenger, whom they just figured was passed out drunk. He was not passed out. He was dead. The man, 25-year-old Marine Terry Lee Gambrell, was slumped in his seat with his eyes closed and a jacket thrown over his lap. At his feet were beer bottles and subscription tablets out in the open for everyone to see. When the officer shook Terry, he didn't respond, and his skin was already cold. The officer noticed a clear ligature mark around his neck where Terry had been strangled. His hands were tied with shoelaces, and it was discovered that the jacket had been thrown over his lap to hide the fact that his pants were pulled down to his ankles. While Terry was taken to the morgue and Kraft moved to the interrogation room, they searched his car, where they found 9 different prescription medications, all of them appropriate to knock someone out cold if they were used with nefarious intentions. They found a pocket knife on one of the seats, and the passenger seat was stained with old blood. The blood did not belong to Terry, who had no physical wounds. Maybe that blood belonged to one of the men in the Polaroids they found. 47 photos of young men, all dead or unconscious, in various stages of undress. These pictures were not taken with their knowledge, that's for sure. But most disturbing of all was the notepad that they found in the trunk. On it was a neatly printed list of 61 victims. On the page were abbreviations, places, names, and occasional numeric notations, all written in a form of shorthand that Kraft apparently invented himself. Investigators interpreted as references to locations, victim descriptions, dates, sexual acts, and possible double victim entries. It didn't take a genius to figure out that this was a victims list, and subsequently why he was later dubbed the Scorecard Killer, the last of 3 hideous monsters that had been using the whole of California as their own personal hunting grounds for the past 2 decades. And also, the worst of them all. To put this into perspective, William Bonin is thought to have killed around 36 boys, an astronomical amount, but Kraft was even worse. The papers dubbed these killings the Freeway Killer, mistaking the 3 separate killers for one singular killer. It was only after his arrest and the discovery of that macabre victims list that Kraft was given the moniker the Scorecard Killer. The arrest suddenly went from stagnant to a raging tsunami of information flooding in. While a team was working on identifying the abbreviated names of Kraft's so-called scorecard, another was sent to Kraft's house. There, they found the couch depicted in the Polaroids. The fibers on it matched some of the fibers found on some of the dead men and boys around California. The garbage held jackets, belts, jewelry, and the personal effects of several more victims. And Kraft's boyfriend, Jeffrey Seelig, was standing in the middle of the chaos, completely dumbfounded that his partner of several years was in the middle of a serial killer investigation that had the state in an uproar for the past decade. Sure, Kraft partied a little too much, and he had a taste for reckless behavior, but by all means, the freelance data processing consultant was as unassuming as any other nerd in the industry. And here's where we can go back to tracing Kraft's steps, starting with his early life, working our way through the dozens of boys that died at his hands, and finally to the point where he was arrested. Taking it from the arrest point would be an absolute mess. Like I said, there were 3 separate killers with the same MO, running around Cali at the same time. But they weren't even a fraction of the murderers that were using California as a playground between the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In those 30 years, there were 12 confirmed serial killers in the state and about as many clusters that were suspected to be serial murders as well. Honestly, California was such a hotbed that I seriously considered doing a series on the state like I've been doing with the highway killings. So let's take this from the top. Randy Stephen Kraft was the 4th child of Opal and Harold Kraft, born in March of 1945. After 3 girls, their youngest son was the apple of their eye. And not just for Opal and Harold Kraft, the girls adored their little brother to distraction. Kraft wasn't spoiled with extravagant girls and toys. Instead, he was spoiled with love, attention, and an unlimited amount of joy. The Kraft family were religious, hardworking, and genuinely decent people. And Randy, by all accounts, was the shining example of a good, studious, and polite little boy that such a rich and attentive upbringing could produce. Randy entered college as a rather finicky, A-type personality. He was often described as anal retentive and very clearly gay. Not exactly a desirable trait for a parent back in the 60s. When he graduated and entered the Air Force, he came out to his parents and superiors. Unfortunately, they weren't as tolerant as the more liberal college campus had been. He was nearly disowned by his family, and the Air Force promptly discharged him on medical grounds, a common way to exclude servicemen on the grounds of their sexuality. Randy responded by throwing himself into the gay club scene with such an alarming ferocity that his friends barely recognized him. He drank heavily, gambled, and did drugs. It got so bad that they said they never saw him sleep anymore. But it was the back rooms of the gay scene in those days that really changed him. There, in those dark and hidden corners, people indulged in their desires, going completely unchecked. This is not a dig at the LGBTQ community. This was the reality. In the 1960s and 70s, Gay clubs were often the only places where people could gather openly, but they were also spaces where vulnerable people collected. Because these venues operated on the margins of society, they sometimes attracted predatory individuals, drug activity, and unsafe conditions. Without strong legal protections or community oversight, abuse and exploitation could flourish, making nightlife both liberating and dangerous. Kraft might not have shown any inclination toward violence before, but here he threw himself into the BDSM scene with more fervor than he'd ever done before. His short relationships all reported that he was a monster in the bedroom, insatiable, and utterly obsessed with inflicting pain and domination. When he wasn't scaring his boyfriends to death, he was in parks at night, hooking up with anything that moved. Reckless, instant gratification, hot-tempered, indulgent, controlling. These were words commonly used to describe what Kraft had become. And like all breakneck fast downward spirals, soon it wasn't enough to satisfy him. He needed more, and the whips and the cuffs weren't cutting it anymore. The first indication that Kraft was well and truly off in the deep end was in March of 1970. Kraft met a 13-year-old runaway, Joseph Alban Franker, on Huntington Beach. He offered Joseph a place to sleep, but when the boy got to Kraft's apartment, he was drugged, beaten, and assaulted for hours. Kraft took a Polaroid of Joseph, adding them to the pile of other Polaroids he'd collected over the years of his various sexual interactions with other men. Joseph managed to escape when Kraft left to go to his bartending job. Unfortunately, police searched the apartment without a warrant. Joseph admitted to taking the pills voluntarily, and he did not disclose to police that he'd been sexually assaulted. All of this resulted in the case being thrown out before it could even go to trial. It's here that Kraft realized that if he was going to force someone to endure torture and beatings, then he couldn't risk them getting away from him alive. Whatever sick fantasies he had, the rest of the world didn't operate the way he did. Kraft enrolled into college again, took up a job as a forklift driver on Huntington Beach, one of his favorite places to pick up dates and victims. And for the first year and a half, it went all right. The arrest scared him into the straight and narrow for a while, but demons that burrow that deep only hibernate temporarily. On October the 5th, 1971, when Kraft was 25, the body of Wayne Joseph Duquette was found on the side of the Ortega Highway in Orange County. Wayne worked at a gay bar that Kraft was known to frequent. The bar's name was The Stable, a word that was noted on Kraft's scorecard. For that reason, it's almost certain that he was Kraft's first victim. Wayne's body was severely decomposed, making the cause of death impossible to determine. Since the original scorecard is a little hard to make out, I've got a typed out version of each entry, who it belongs to, and the basic details of each crime scene allotted to that entry. On the occasion that the victim can be tied to a scorecard entry, I'll put that screenshot up for you, so feel free to pause the video at those intervals, if you feel like it. Moving on, entry number 3 on the scorecard had the initials EDM scribbled down. It definitely referred to 20-year-old Marine Edward Daniel Moore. Moore was found on the 405 freeway. His body was thrown from a moving vehicle in December of 1972. His remains were badly beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted, and even after death, Kraft had mutilated his genitals, including stuffing a sock into the victim's rectum. The use of the sock needs some explaining, as it would become somewhat of a calling card for Kraft. This was most likely done after death to prevent the corpses from leaking bodily fluids onto his car seats when he drove them to their respective dump sites. Another thing found on a lot of the victims were bits of tissue paper stuffed into their nostrils. This led police to quickly come to the conclusion that the killer had a military background. It's an old army trick to plug a corpse's orifices to keep those open cavities from regurgitating bodily fluids after death. 6 weeks later, a new John Doe was found beside the Terminal Island Freeway. This victim was in his late teens and also had a sock jammed into his rectal passage. He's never been identified. Here's where I'm going to go through the victims fast. I really want to give each of them a name, a face, and their identity back when I can. So much of their lives have been lost under the sheer horror that Kraft inflicted upon them. I cannot tell each of their stories in full, but I can give you their names and faces. The grown men were usually Marines that were kidnapped at bars. The teenagers were also abducted from the streets. And then there were a few patrons at local gay bars and hitchhikers in the mix too. The victims were fed a cocktail of Valium and beer, just enough to render them incapable of fighting back, but conscious enough to suffer through the pain of their torture. Once Kraft was satisfied, he strangled them with their own shoelaces and belts. The sock and tissue paper kept cropping up, and all of the victims were hideously mutilated, almost always culminating in complete castration. There were foreign objects inserted into their urethras, and they were bitten, beaten, and slashed with knives or shards of glass. After all this, he loaded them into his car and dumped them on a freeway. So keep up. I'm going to go through them fast. At the start of 1973, a John Doe was found on Gothard Street in Huntington Beach. In April, 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey was discovered in Huntington Beach, this time fully dressed, but it was definitely the same killer. Kevin had been assaulted, strangled, his genitals were nearly bitten clean off, and he too had that signature sock in his rectum. In May, 2 more bodies were discovered. One was dismembered, scattered between San Pedro, Long Beach, and Sunset Beach. The second John Doe had been refrigerated after death. Refrigeration and the dismemberment was new to Kraft, so he was starting to experiment. Neither has ever been identified. The discovery of 20-year-old Ronnie Weeb next to the 405 freeway was unusual too. The coroner suspected that he'd been hung upside down due to the mass amounts of blood in his skull. These victims could have been any of the entries on the scorecard. It's impossible to tell which ones they were. But the next entry, number 7, can be tied definitively to the next victim, Vincent Cruz Mestas, whose body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains on December 29, 1973. Vincent's murder was even more gruesome. Besides the usual tortures, his head was shaved clean and his hands were severed while he was still alive. For 6 months, Kraft went quiet. No one quite knows why, but he sure made up for lost time when he came back. 5 bodies were found between November and August of 74. 20-year-old Malcolm Eugene Little, 19-year-old James Dale Reeves, 18-year-old Marine Roger Edward Dickerson, 23-year-old Gary Wayne Cordova, and 25-year-old Thomas Paxton Lee. Because these 5 were all killed at random, their torture and murders mostly taking place in wooded areas where the killer left their bodies. Kraft had always thrown his victims' bodies from moving vehicles, but these victims were displayed after death, seated upright, leaning on trees, with branches penetrating their rectums. This was now a ritualistic setting, meant to display his work so that everyone would know who'd done it. Thomas Lee was also the odd one out here. He'd been fed a cocktail of Valium and booze, leading to a premature overdose. Apparently, Kraft wasn't interested in Thomas after he died so fast. Now that he was incapable of suffering through the pain, Kraft dumped him, fully dressed and physically unharmed, on a highway. In his private life, Kraft was finishing up a degree in computers and even found steady work. His employers described him as perfectionistic, on time, and incredibly reliable. He had a boyfriend at the time named Jeffrey Graves. Though nothing's ever been proven, police always suspected that Graves might have had some part in the murders up to this point, because 2 sets of shoe prints were found at several of the Woodland crime scenes. The same double set of footprints were found at the murder of 17-year-old John William Leras. The high schooler was on his way to the roller rink when he was abducted off the street, force-fed enough alcohol to render him nearly comatose, and tortured for hours. In January of 75, Craig Victor Jonitis was found discarded in the parking lot of the Golden Sails Hotel near the Pacific Coast Highway, strangled with a shoelace. It's here that the FBI finally started honing in on Kraft as a separate killer from the other Freeway murders. The papers were right after all. I know it sounds like an excessive long time before admitting to that fact. I mean, it started in 71, and this was now already early in 1975. That's just 4 years, and if you've been keeping count, 15 known victims that fit the MO and can be tied to a scorecard entry. But remember, there were several killers targeting boys, men, women, and everyone else. Seriously finding a pattern to tie to a specific killer that escalated every year or two during this awful time isn't all that surprising. Outside of a few green fibers and 2 sets of footprints, and then only at a handful of crime scenes, let's face it, the cops had nothing. That would change with the double attack of 19 and 17-year-olds Kevin Crotwell and Kent May. Yep, like clockwork, Kraft escalated again. One victim's hideous torture was no longer enough. He needed a bigger risk. He lured them into his car with beer that he laced with Valium. Kent, the 17-year-old, started feeling woozy and was in no state to defend himself when Kraft opened the car door and shoved him out of the moving vehicle. Keith was already passed out, and several witnesses saw the boy slumped in his seat while the other was thrown onto the sidewalk. These witnesses happened to be friends with the boys. They described the distinctive dark Mustang in detail and reported that they recognized the driver as possibly being a regular at a gay bar in the neighborhood. Keith's skull was found on a jetty close to the Long Beach Marina. The coroner wrote it off as an accidental drowning. I know. It's insane that a medical professional can be so inconceivably lazy that he writes a single, fleshless skull off as a drowning. When Keith's friends heard about the news, they decided to search for the car themselves. The boys found the car just a mile away from the abduction scene, took down the plates, and handed it in to police. You'll be astounded to hear that the cops checked out the lead. They found Kraft, who admitted to picking the boys up. He said that he gently dropped Keith off on the sidewalk and that Kent was totally conscious and chipper throughout the ride. When the car got stuck in an embankment, Kraft walked up to a payphone that he used to call his boyfriend, Jeffrey Graves, to help him out. They dropped the young man off at a cafe and never saw him again. Jeffrey Graves confirmed the call, further cementing the theory that he was involved in some of the murders. As guilty as Kraft looked, he did have a shaky alibi, and there was no other evidence to tie him to the crime, so he was let off, only to be arrested a few months later for lewd exposure in a park with another casual hookup. These back-to-back brushes with the law and the fact that Patrick Kearney was charged with 28 murders at the same time scared Kent straight for a few months. There were no other bodies found that suited his MO or additions to that now infamous scorecard. Jeffrey Graves also left Kraft for good, never to see him again. He is suspected to have assisted Kraft in at least 10 murders. The now 30-year-old Kraft moved on to a new consulting job and a new boyfriend, 19-year-old Jeffrey Seelig. Seelig was never suspected of any of the murders during their relationship. Heck, he was adamant that Kraft might have had an insatiable appetite, but he'd never shown any inclination toward violence when he was with Seelig. I do believe the theory that Seelig had no clue what his on-off-again boyfriend was up to. So for that reason, I will not be showing his face. On Halloween night of 75, Larry Gene Walters vanished, never to be seen again, from a party that Kraft confirmed to attend by several witnesses. On December the 12th, 1975, Paul Fuchs disappeared, which, FYI, is my date of birth, and the day that I happen to be writing this because I have zero social life. Self-deprecation aside, Paul vanished from a bar that Kraft was seen at by multiple witnesses. He's never been found. 2 weeks later, on the 31st, Mark Hall, a 22-year-old, disappeared from a New Year's party. Kraft hadn't just come out of hiding, he had just committed his most brutal killing yet. The damage to Mark's body was just horrific. His eyes had been burned out with a car's cigarette lighter. The inanimate objects used on him went so deep that they ended up in his bladder. Every inch of that man's body was slashed, burned, and brutalized. Mark was alive for most of the torture. It's hard to say if he died of blood loss or from choking on dirt and leaves, or if his heart just gave out from the pain. The unhinged attack at least had one payoff. Kraft was so out of control that he finally slipped up. A broken bottle at the scene had a perfect print on it. Without the power of search engines and databases in the 80s, they had to wait for someone to tie that print to directly. So for now, it sat in evidence patiently waiting for a suspect to appear. In March, the mutilated body of U.S. Marine Scott Michael Hughes was found beside the on-ramp of the 91 freeway. The next month, Roland Gerald Young was discovered. Roland had just been released from jail for public intoxication. 6 hours later, he was dead. The notation in the scorecard labeled jailbreak is thought to belong to Roland. In June, another Marine, Richard Allen Keith, was found, and a month later, Keith Klingbeil was thrown out on the I-5 highway. Miraculously, Keith was still alive, despite suffering the same tortures as those before him. Sadly, he died just minutes before paramedics arrived. Richard Crosby, a hitchhiker, was discarded 200 yards north of Highway 71 in San Bernardino on September the 29th. The final victim of 1975 was 21-year-old truck driver Michael Joseph Enderbeaton, whose castrated body was found along an on-ramp to the I-605. Michael's eyelids had been burned off completely, and yes, he was alive for this torture. And then Kraft took another break. This is highly unusual for a serial killer. Most of the time, the urge to kill just escalates over time, becoming more frequent. This habit of going on a hiatus for any amount of time after killing consistently every few weeks is now the third occasion that he's done this. Kraft was busy, however. He'd bought a house, got an even better paying job, and by all appearances, things were going really well for his relationship and career. So maybe he was just happy. Not that a demon like this probably even knew how to identify any kind of human emotion. Who knows what was going on inside that twisted little noggin of his? Kraft came out of that dark, torturous hole again on June 16, 1979, when he abducted a 20-year-old Marine named Donnie Harold Crizzle. Donnie would be the 26th known victim on the scorecard that we know about. 2 months later, 21-year-old English tourist Keith Anthony Jackson's leg, torso, and head were found in 2 trash bags and a cardboard box. If it weren't for the sock inside the rectal cavity, Keith would never have been tied to the Scorecard Killer. 19-year-old Gregory Wallace Jolly was found in Lake Arrowhead 2 weeks later, and his possessions would be some of those that could be identified in Kraft's home just a few weeks later. On a short business trip to Portland, Kraft killed 17-year-old Michael Sean O'Fallon on July the 17th, 1979, and 30-year-old Vietnam vet Larry Eugene Parks. Michael's camera was taken as a souvenir. A 19-year-old Marine named Robert Wyatt Loggins was found discarded in a trash bag close to the El Toro Marine Air Base in September 1980. Polaroids of Robert, most of them too gruesome to be released to the public, were discovered in Kraft's house after his arrest. In April of 1981, 17-year-old hitchhiker Michael Cluck was found beside the Interstate 5 freeway close to Goshen, Oregon. Apparently, Michael fought back hard. Kraft's foot was injured during the attack, and he was so angered by Michael's defiance that he bludgeoned him to death. Michael was struck 31 times, virtually pulverizing his skull. That hospital visit to receive stitches correlated to the exact day that Michael went missing. 17-year-old male prostitute Christopher Allen Williams was found in the San Bernardino Mountains just as Kraft signed up for a consulting job at an aerospace engineering company in 1980. His employers described Kraft as helpful, an excellent problem solver, and extremely effective at his job. This piece of crap was clocking in an annual income of nearly $200,000 a year in today's money, and everyone around him was singing his praises. You literally can't find a better example of a monster hiding in plain sight than Randy Kraft. Kraft traveled frequently, and it's certain that he killed more people during those travels. Tracing those murders is nearly impossible, leaving us with a nearly 2-year gap again until June of 1982. Raymond Davis, just 14 years old, was killed and discarded at the Rampart Boulevard off-ramp. Raymond disappeared while looking for his missing dog in Echo Park. Raymond's entry on the list was named Dog. Just 40 feet away from Raymond's body, investigators found the remains of 16-year-old Robert Avila. His entry is thought to be named Deodorant because Robert was known to be heavy-handed with the body spray. While Kraft was on a business trip in Portland, several bodies turned up. First, a 24-year-old Modesto man named Arn Michael Lane was found on a hillside outside the town of Ramona, and 26-year-old Brian Witcher was dumped on the Interstate 5 freeway. Brian was a heavy drinker and a raging homophobe. He and Kraft were seen at the same bar talking the night that Brian disappeared. Brian wasn't subjected to torture to the degree that the rest were. He was given enough prescription medication to cause an overdose. It's thought that Kraft just wanted him dead because of his hatred toward the gay community. He went back to his usual torture techniques just a few days later with the murder of Anthony Jose Silvera and 19-year-old Lance Trenton Taggs. Lance was dumped just yards away from where Brian Witcher's body was found. Then Kraft committed a double murder, 2 cousins, Dennis Alt and Christopher Schonborn. He met them in the same hotel that he was staying at, dumping their bodies right behind that same hotel. The astounding amount of evidence left behind by Kraft should have led to his arrest then and there. He was seen talking to the cousins inside the hotel the night they went missing. Christopher's body was found with a pen with the hotel's emblem embossed on it, shoved into his urethra. Inside the hotel room that Kraft stayed in, he left a set of keys belonging to Christopher and a jacket belonging to Anthony Jose Silvera, whom he killed just days before. Kraft took some of Christopher's clothes home with him. Both Dennis and Christopher's Polaroids were key pieces of evidence used in court. The Oregon police suspected that this killer might be related to the Freeway killer in California, but Kraft's name just landed in a pile of other suspects, and he was subsequently never questioned for the 6 murders that happened in less than a month in the city of Portland. Again, Kraft took another year off. Maybe he realized that his outrageous victim count in Oregon and the inordinate amount of mistakes he'd made was going to start attracting attention soon. But at least this time, when he resurfaced, it would be the final year of the Scorecard Killer's time terrorizing his victims. And just in case you had trouble keeping count, hell, I sure did. That's 44 known victims so far. In January of 1983, Kraft, now 38 years old, killed a 21-year-old hitchhiker, Eric Herbert Church. Eric's remains had a decent enough semen sample on it that later matched to Kraft's blood type. A month later, another pair of cousins were abducted during a midnight snack run to a corner store. 18-year-old Jeffrey Allen Nelson and 20-year-old Roger James Duvall Jr. Jeffrey's body was still warm when they found him on the Garden Grove Freeway's off-ramp. All 3 of the victims that month were featured in Kraft's collection of Polaroids. Exactly 30 days later was when Kraft was pulled over with the body of Terry Lee Gambrell in the front seat. It didn't take long to get enough physical evidence in Kraft's home and car to take him to court for 16 of the 48 suspected murders that we know of. I mentioned that the scorecard had 61 entries on it, but investigators believe that Kraft's particular way of making notes possibly grouped more than one victim together. Their estimate on his victim count is closer to 68, and they feel that they've tied 45 of those victims to the 61 entries on the scorecard. And I agree with their assessment. I found 15 other victims during his 12-year killing spree that were too decomposed to determine MO, and that's not counting the John Does that were never properly investigated. There were definitely men in those Polaroids that investigators couldn't identify, and many personal effects in Kraft's house that couldn't be tied to any known victims. To think that there were more victims is completely feasible. Jeffrey Graves, the ex-boyfriend that helped Kraft kill nearly a dozen young men and kids, died in 1987 before police could question him. It was later revealed that there were DNA samples that couldn't be tested back in the 80s, but with Graves now dead, it would be a waste of resources. All of the crime scenes that Graves was implicated in were not brought to trial. Instead, they focused on the 16 murders that they could prove were done by Kraft, thanks to fingerprints, positive blood type matches, fibers, Polaroids, victims' possessions found in his house, and gas receipts that proved he was in those areas when the victims died. I know it's not perfect, and that there are nearly 50 families out there who deserve closure, but they did the right thing. By being found guilty of these 16 murders, they could ensure that Kraft got the death penalty. Not that that meant much at the end of the day. Oh, don't get me wrong, he was found guilty, but he's still on death row to this day, eating and breathing our tax dollars like the parasite that he is. A year ago, I'd have told you I was against the death penalty, but now, let's just say that I've seen enough cases to convince me otherwise. Kraft was a monster, a truly evil animal that has proven at least 61 times that he does not deserve to breathe the same air we do. And as far as I'm concerned, he's taking way too long to die. This concludes entry number 10 of our Highway Killers series. You could almost say that we have our own scorecard going on over here. And the truth is that our list is probably going to be even longer than the scorecard that Randy Kraft kept. So subscribe and put that notification bell on so you don't miss any of the rest of this series that's coming your way. And leave a comment while you're at it. Which highway killer would you like to hear about next? And do you think Kraft will admit to the murders before he dies? Hopefully giving names to those last victims on the scorecard that could never be identified. Personally, I don't think there's enough humanity inside that monstrosity to give the families closure. But I guess we can at least hope for a miracle. See you in the next one, people.